Ever since Ukraine developed the capability to hit targets inside Russia, it has executed an intelligence strategy designed to damage the Russian war machine. Every strike is precise, carefully chosen to damage at least one aspect of that machine, with the ultimate goal being to disrupt Russia's soldiers on the front lines so badly that they can't complete their offensives. Over the weekend, Ukraine hit Russia hard from a distance. Thanks to a trio of strikes, Russia burns, and Russia proved itself powerless against a Ukraine that just put it through 72 hours of hell. It all started late on the evening of September 12th, the Kyiv Independent reports. On that night, drone operators from Ukraine's 14th Unmanned Aircraft Regiment kicked off a 4-hour swarm of around 230 long-range drones that marked Ukraine's largest single-night air raid of the war so far. Though these drones headed to targets all over Russia, the 30 drones that Ukraine launched at the Leningrad region were the most important of the night. Why? They were heading to the Primorsk oil pumping station. Arriving at around midnight, those drones dived, one after another, to wreak havoc on one of Russia's most important Baltic Sea facilities. The BBC says that this Primorsk station is essentially an oil port, acting as the final station of the Baltic pipeline system. That means it's a hub for all of Russia's maritime exports that utilize the Baltic Sea, including much of the seaborne oil that it's selling to other nations that allows Vladimir Putin to continue his brutal invasion of Ukraine. The port is also home to several of the aging oil tankers that make up Russia's shadow fleet. It was these tankers that were Ukraine's main target on September 12th. According to a Reuters report on the strike, Ukraine's drones managed to hit a pair of shadow fleet tankers, the Kusto and Kayun. The former is an Aframax tanker, the outlet notes, and is capable of carrying around 700,000 barrels of oil. Kayun is also owned by Aframax, though Reuters doesn't provide any figures in terms of capacity. The Kyiv Post says that the Kayun is a 109,000-ton ship, while the Kusto is a 105,000-ton vessel. So it's likely safe to assume that Ukraine's attack took out a pair of ships capable of transporting around 1.4 million barrels of oil between them, which is massive considering how vital oil is for funding Putin's war. The Kyiv Post adds that Ukraine also managed to hit the Phosphor, which sails out of Hong Kong and is a 51,000-ton vessel. Assuming weight amounts to oil carried, that would suggest that the Phosphor can hold around 300,000 barrels of oil. Interestingly, the first two ships are registered in the Seychelles, not Russia, Reuters says. The Kyiv Post notes that both sail under the flag of Sierra Leone, meaning there are a couple of degrees of separation from Russia here. And that offers a big hint that these two ships are, or were, part of the Russian shadow fleet that has allowed Putin to continue selling oil while Russia deals with Western sanctions. Russia's shadow fleet is one of its most important weapons in the war. Granted, it's not a weapon Russia can use to strike Ukraine. However, this shady fleet of tankers and other vessels is broken up into two divisions, Oxford Analytica reports. The first, known as the Grey Fleet, consists of ships that appear to have law-abiding ownership but their origins obscured in an attempt to destroy any link to Russia. Vessels registered in the Seychelles and sailing under the flag of Sierra Leone, while clearly being Russian assets, offer a perfect example. The second division is the Dark Fleet. Russia makes no attempt to appear law-abiding with these ships. Instead, these vessels use a number of techniques such as jamming electronic location sensors via spoofing and disabling automated identification systems to make it difficult for authorities to even figure out that they are sailing, never mind working out where they come from or where they're heading. Russia began building its shadow fleet in the wake of Western sanctions designed to prevent it from transporting its seaborne oil to its many customers. The idea was simple: stop the ships and you prevent the flow of money into Putin's wartime coffers. Russia's response was to build a hidden fleet numbering several hundred ships, many of which operate out of Primorsk. Joachim Håkansson, who captains the KBV-003 Coast Guard ship that operates in the Baltic Sea, explained the depth of the shadow fleet problem to The Guardian on September 13th. "There are hundreds of shadow ships moving in the Baltic all the time, and it's a lot for our little sea here," Håkansson tells the outlet. "We see ships that have never been seen in the Baltic before that we come across now. Allowing those ships to sail without question is risky, not just due to how Russia is using them to fund Putin's war, but also because many of the shadow fleet vessels are old and in poor states of repair. If there was an oil accident with these ships, there would be an oil catastrophe in the Baltic," Håkansson reveals. It's difficult to determine how much money Russia has made from its shadow fleet. However, Ukrainian Shipping Magazine revealed that Russia had spent $14 billion on shadow fleet ships by May 2025, so you have to imagine it's earned many billions more than that to justify the investment. To Ukraine, the possibility of an oil crisis is secondary to cutting off the cash that the shadow fleet ensures can still enter Russia. Taking out 3 tankers won't put an end to a 100-strong fleet of vessels, but it will be enough to prevent around 1.5 million barrels of oil from reaching their destination, at least for now. and that means Russia's cash flow has been disrupted. The Kyiv Post said on September 15th that none of the 3 ships Ukraine hit 3 days before have moved from their Primorsk piers. This tells us that the ships haven't sunk, but they've been damaged enough to prevent them from sailing. The Kusto appears to have been the most heavily damaged of the 3, with the explosions that occurred on the ship forcing the evacuation of its 28 crew members. No casualties were reported, but Ukraine won't care about that. It's enough that Ukraine's drones scuttled the ship. To make matters worse for Russia, it wasn't just Shadow Fleet vessels that Ukraine's Primorsk strike shut down. 2 of Primorsk's 4 loading stations, which Russia uses for its crude oil transfers, also had to cease operations thanks to the strike on the Kusto. Damage to onshore pipelines and pumping equipment seems likely, meaning Ukraine may have just cut down Primorsk's loading capacity by 50%. The same outlet also suggests that Ukraine used the Lyuchi drone to carry out the Primorsk strike. In past strikes over 800-kilometer (500-mile) distances, Ukraine has most often used the UJ-22 Lyuchi drone, a precision-guided, propeller-driven aircraft with a 75-kilogram (165-pound) warhead, the Kyiv Post suggested. Ukraine hasn't made the specific drone it used public, but the Lyuchi seems a likely candidate. United 24 Media reported back in November 2024 that this specific drone had received an upgrade, increasing its warhead to the 75 kilograms that the Kyiv Post mentions, in addition to the expansion of its strike range to around 2,000 kilometers, or about 1,200 miles. If Ukraine needs to hit a target at distance, the Lyuchi is the perfect choice, at least until Ukraine perfects long-range missile drones like the Flamingo, which will deliver an even heavier punch. On September 15th, Bloomberg reported that at least 2 tankers have completed loading at Primorsk, suggesting the facility is at least partially online. Loadings have been suspended since Ukraine's attack, but even if Russia gets Primorsk back to full capacity soon, the impact of this strike will be felt in the 3 potentially lost Shadow Fleet ships, and the message Ukraine just sent: we hit Primorsk once, we can hit it again. Ukraine's strike against the Shadow Fleet tankers in Primorsk marks the first time that it has used long-range drones to take out these types of ships. Previously, it scuttled Russian tankers using seaborne drones and operatives who planted bombs on the ships, but this one strike would have been enough to leave Russia licking a pretty major wound if that were all Ukraine pulled off over the weekend. But Primorsk wasn't Ukraine's only target, not by a long shot. Ukraine gave Russia 2 days to recover from its largest ever long-range drone assault before striking again on September 14th. This time, the Kyiv Post says Ukraine sent a horde of between 80 and 90 drones into Russia. As with the September 12th strike, these drones were sent to hit several targets, but there is one that stands out as the headline hit: the Kurishi oil refinery, which is about 60 miles southeast of St. Petersburg. Kurishi is a fairly important refinery, the Kyiv Post reveals. It has an annual capacity of between 17 and 20 million tons of oil, which accounts for about 6% of Russia's total refining capacity. Right now, it seems that the refinery doesn't play a key role in keeping Russia's troops in Ukraine supplied with fuel, though it's possible that some of its products may reach soldiers. Far more important is Kurishi's role as the main supplier of refined oil products to St. Petersburg, which is Russia's second wealthiest city behind Moscow, and the surrounding regions of Leningrad, Novgorod, and Pskov. The Kyiv Post says that Ukraine managed to hit this refinery hard. At least 2 of its drones hit the plant's main cracking tower, which is used to break crude oil's long-chain hydrocarbon molecules into smaller molecules, resulting in gasoline and similar refined products. In short, no cracking tower means no refining, resulting in the Kurishi plant becoming practically useless. Ukraine's drones set the tower ablaze, creating a mini mushroom cloud explosion as they did. Russia, of course, is trying to pretend that the damage is less severe than it really is. The Leningrad regional governor, Alexander Drozdenko, has already trotted out the excuse that we've heard more times than we can count from Russia. This wasn't a successful drone attack by Ukraine, the Kyiv Post reports. No, this fire was caused by what seems to have become Ukraine's most powerful weapon, drone debris, created by Russia's superior air defenses shooting Ukraine's long-range drones down. The fire was also minor enough to have been put out in a couple of hours, Drozdenko claims, though the Kyiv Post says that satellite images showing structural damage to processing units and refinery fuel storage tell a different story. Reuters adds that Drozdenko claims that Russia destroyed 3 drones in the Kurishi region on the night of Ukraine's attack, according to Reuters. That's at odds with the Kyiv Post report, and also doesn't seem to be enough to account for the scale of the damage. Something about Russia's response to this strike doesn't add up. And Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was quick to point out that Ukraine's refinery strikes are far more effective than Russia will ever bring itself to admit. The most effective sanctions, the sanctions that work the fastest, are firing on Russian oil plants, on their terminals, on their oil depots, Zelensky said in a video address praising Ukraine's September 14th strike. They have significantly restricted the Russian oil industry, and this significantly limits the war. Zelensky isn't wrong. Beyond the problems that refinery strikes create for Russia's soldiers, who see the supplies of fuel they need for their mechanized and aerial assaults cut down with every refinery taken offline, Ukraine's refinery strikes are creating massive problems inside Russia. In August, Ukraine conducted a series of refinery strikes, often targeting the same refineries several times within weeks. That caused parts of Russia to run dry. On August 28th, The Independent reported that gasoline shortages were affecting some of the more far-flung regions of Russia, such as its Far East and the annexed Crimean Peninsula. In addition to raising the cost of gas to about $3.58 per gallon in regions where the average monthly wage is just $1,200. The situation was becoming so bad that some drivers were taking advantage, selling their gasoline for around $10 per gallon to make a quick profit. Fast forward half a month and the situation is only getting worse. On September 10th, United 24 media reported that the shortages affecting Russia's more remote regions have spread to more populated areas, including Ryazan, Saratov, and Rostov. By that point, Ukraine had knocked out about 17% of Russia's refining capacity, which amounts to about 1.1 million barrels per day. With the strike against the Kurishi refinery, Ukraine is just adding to a tally that is already far too high from Russia's perspective. Another refinery taken offline means even more fuel shortages inside Russia. Only this time those shortages are going to affect St. Petersburg. Massive queues at gas stations may be acceptable in Russia's poorer regions, but when those queues start appearing in one of the country's wealthiest regions due to Ukraine taking out the refinery that supplies it, even those Russians who will never have to worry about being sent to Ukraine will start to feel the impact of the war their leaders started firsthand. This is all about pressure. Zelensky's mention of Ukraine's drones being the most effective sanction out there tells you everything that you need to know. With Western sanctions being slow to effect, or as is the case with Russia's shadow fleet, failing, Ukraine taking out Russia's oil refineries creates a new type of pressure. Now Russia's citizens, including some of its wealthiest, are feeling the heat of the Ukraine war in the form of fuel shortages. Ukraine is trying to force Russia's people to ask themselves how long they'll be willing to put up with this before they do something about Putin. With a little luck, Zelensky will also be hoping that the West's oil sanctions become more effective in conjunction with Ukraine's long-range drone strikes. Just a day before the Kurishi strike, US President Donald Trump wrote an open letter to all NATO nations, which he posted on Truth Social. "I am ready to do some major sanctions on Russia when all NATO nations have agreed and started to do the same thing, and when all NATO nations stop buying oil from Russia," Trump said. He accused NATO's commitment to winning the Ukraine war of being less than 100% due to these oil purchases, adding, "Anyway, I'm ready to go. Where are you? Just say when." For its part, the European Union has instituted a deadline to phase out all of its oil and gas exports by 2028, though that may be too slow for Trump and even Zelensky. If Trump's pressure tactics work and the NATO nations that still buy Russian oil find other suppliers, Ukraine's strikes against facilities like Kurishi will be even more effective. So Russian oil tankers were hit, its major Baltic Sea oil port was shut down, albeit temporarily, and yet another refinery is in flames. What was already a terrible weekend for Russia was capped by a final attack that also targeted St. Petersburg's energy infrastructure. A combined operation by the SBU and Ukraine's intelligence agency, or HUR, resulted in a fully loaded fuel train being blown up sometime during the night of September 13th into 14th. Specifically, the Kyiv Post reports, two of Ukraine's most dangerous agencies managed to use explosives to take out a loaded fuel train as it moved along the Oryol-St. Petersburg line. The attack did plenty of damage, killing a pair of train guards and severely injuring a railroad worker, in addition to halting traffic on a major railway line for at least 24 hours, the outlet reported. This was a very different kind of attack from the others we've covered in this video. Where those used Ukraine's long-range drones, this strike saw HUR and the SBU plant mines along the tracks on which the train would be traveling. Those mines detonated as the train rolled over them, derailing it and knocking 15 fuel cars off their tracks. It's unknown if those cars were damaged or if they lost fuel they were carrying, but even if they're intact, they're not getting to wherever they're supposed to be going anytime soon, which is a clear win for Ukraine. We don't know much more about this operation. The Independent reports that an unnamed Ukrainian military source says that what Ukraine pulled off on the Oryol-St. Petersburg line was a uniquely complex operation designed to disrupt Russia's railway traffic. It's also clear that this specific attack was designed to deprive Russia's troops in Ukraine of the fuel they needed, with the source stating, "These railway lines are critical supply routes for Russian forces operating in the Kharkiv and Sumy directions. Both of these regions were targets of Putin's failed summer offensive, and it's clear that Ukraine is now doing everything it can to prevent Russia from building any momentum in those areas." Russia will worry that Ukraine is now targeting its rail network. As the Jamestown Foundation points out, railway infrastructure is vital to Russia's economy, as the country's rail network is still the main way that it moves goods and people in, out, and around the country. The Ukrainian source's mention of Kharkiv and Sumy also shows us that Russia has been using its railways to send supplies into Ukraine. Kasper Cant, writing for the International Center for Defense and Security in December 2024, explains why Russia's rails are now a problem. The Russian rail network has shown itself to be central to the Russian war effort. Due to its colossal size, the rail network has also proven vulnerable, Cant writes. Ukraine is now exploiting that vulnerability. Just as worrying for Russia is the nature of this final strike of the weekend. Ukraine didn't send its drones in to do all of the hard work this time. It planted mines in Russian territory. That's not possible unless Ukraine is sending operatives into Russia, or it has turned Russian personnel and convinced them to plant mines on Ukraine's behalf. Either way, what happened on the Oral-St. Petersburg line was a direct sabotage operation that Russia could do nothing to prevent. That fact will worry Putin and his cronies. They're now forced to ask themselves how many of Ukraine's operatives are working on Russian soil and what those operatives are going to do next. Putin won't find any answers. At least he won't until the next Ukrainian strike is carried out on Russian territory. With this trio of attacks, all carried out over the course of a weekend, Ukraine has left some of St. Petersburg's most important energy infrastructure in flames. Russia just endured 3 days of hell in St. Petersburg, but that isn't the end of the story. Ukraine also struck 1,800 kilometers deep into Russia, burning Putin's inner core to the ground during the same weekend. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of Ukraine's latest strikes against Russia. And thank you as always for watching.